Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigus.
Hey everyone, this is the Fly Culture Podcast. Welcome back again. My guest today is Simon Jefferies, fly angler and International Sales Director for Cortland. We will of course be talking about fly fishing, fly lines and their importance as part of our setup. But Simon also, in a previous life, was a golf pro, and I'd be really interested to explore the similarities, if there are any, between our two pastimes. But Simon, it's great to catch up with you as always. How are you doing today?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Pete. It's and thank you for having me on. I'm good. I'm sitting in my office down in Plympton, overlooking the South Hams, and the weather's pretty good today. So yeah, all's good. Thank you.
That's great to hear. And have you, I guess I know the answer to this already because I've asked a number of people this sort of question, but how was your season? Did you get much fishing done? I guess, are you one of these sorts of people as well that works so deeply in the industry you don't get as much time as you would like to fish, or do you make sure you set some time aside to do it?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think anybody that's remotely successful in the fishing industry probably doesn't have the amount of time to fish that they would like. I do try to get out a few times at least every year. I have a regular trip that I do with a few mates where we go to a different place each year. So we tend to, sometimes we'll do rivers and reservoirs, sometimes just reservoirs, depending on where we go. And this year we did a May trip. We went up to Mid Wales and did Clwyddoch and fished we fished the Upper Severn actually for trout, which was a river I'd never fished before, and that was amazing. Had a really good time, just away with 3 or 4 really good friends, and then I guess from there I tend to try and get out to Burrator, which is my nearest reservoir. Fished that 3 or 4 times this year, not as much as I would like, but Burrator's a great early season reservoir, and so when it gets to, especially this year with how hot it was, midsummer was going to be tough. So I tended to leave that alone, and I do fish the rivers down in Devon, fish on the passport scheme which they've got going down here, and try and get out that way. But I guess if I fish once a month, that would be the most. Yeah, that would be the maximum.
Nice. And a road trip with good friends is something I think is to be enjoyed to the maximum. And I think that's I remember when I was guiding, I took some people and I think they were university friends or something like that. And they were sort of in their late 40s, early 50s, but they still got together every year and fished somewhere. Yeah. And when I took them out, it was that one time. But it's interesting you mentioned Burrator as well. And I've got to admit, I've never fished there. But I hear it's quite an interestingly run place. Is that correct in saying?
Yeah, well, it's a beautiful reservoir, and it's there's a club also. There's the Burrator Fishers Association or club, which I joined when I moved down here. And we have 2 boats at the moment. There's plans for another one next year, and it's stocked mainly with rainbows now. There are some resident browns, but it's mainly rainbows, and it's been the one I think for the Southwest this year, which has had, although it is low, but it's not as low as perhaps some of the others like Kennick. So it's a nice place to get away from it, and quite often you'll be maybe, there might be half a dozen people fishing, so it's fairly remote and a good place to get away from it all.
Nice. It's interesting you talk about water levels as well. I went to Colliford, which for listeners is actually, I've done a podcast there. It's just suddenly dawned on me a little while back now. And I went there just before the season ended and was astounded how low it actually looked. And I think it was only 40% full. and some of it was quite, I parked in the first car park there, and you couldn't get to the water there because it was too squidgy, and I ended up around the
Yeah,
dam wall and managed to fluke a couple of
yeah,
fish there. But it was the first cold morning. It was the morning we had the frost as well, so it made it challenging. It's a brown trout only reservoir or lake, and it was quite challenging, but really enjoyable session there. And it just brought home how this summer has been and how the climate's actually impacting things. When you see it for real, it really does strike it home, doesn't it?
absolutely. Yeah, I think Kennick is their kind of, their sort of flagship, if you like, rainbow water, and that's pretty much been unfishable for the last few months. Just again because of the mud, you just can't get to get close enough to fish it. So they decided to stop Burrator, sort of keep stocking Burrator later on in the season, so that it gave at least somewhere where people could go and fish. So yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned on your trip that you sometimes do rivers and lakes. If I sort of got you in a half Nelson and an arm lock, is there anything that you would choose? Would you choose rivers or lakes, or you just enjoy it all, really?
I enjoy both. I think if you'd asked me the question maybe 5 years ago, I would definitely have said rivers. I was a member of the upper team when I lived in Oakhampton, and I fished that quite regularly, and quite a lot of the other rivers. And I never really, I guess I probably didn't understand still water fishing perhaps as much as I should have. And then when I started going on that trip, actually with the guys, where we go away each year, there were a couple of years where we went to the sort of Midlands reservoirs, and I was kind of forced to, if you like, to get on a boat and fish those, and actually became quite fascinated with the whole different, way of fishing, and especially actually with being involved with Cortland now, the different lines that you do need at times to fish those waters. And so the last few years, I've actually got probably more into still water fishing than river fishing. In fact, this year probably I've only had 3 or 4 trips to the river, so it's been mainly still water.
Right.
So it does vary, but yeah, both. I do love both.
That's an interesting transition to make. It's almost, some traditionally may think that's almost the reverse, isn't it, of how we
Absolutely,
used to
'cause
go from still water
yeah,
to moving water.
definitely. And actually, one of my friends that goes on the trip with us, he has done completely the opposite. You could never get him near a river up until about 4 years ago. He would say, "Oh no, I don't go to a river. The water moves." And he was just solely still waters, and now you can't get him off the river. Once he found it, he loves it, and that's where he goes. So yeah, I guess it's just a change that sometimes we all need.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I think, I always think, even if in the spheres that I fish, and I do a little bit of still water, but not as much. I enjoy it every time I do it as much. But within our spheres, we're always evolving and looking to learn. And I think, that's why for many of us that fly fishing's still so interesting, because there's so much we don't know and there's so much to do still and to discover. And the thing I did with carp the other day, on wild carp and catching them on sighted fish on flies, was really, really exciting. And I was shaking like a small kid still. And I don't think that feeling's ever going to go away. And I think, it's wonderful to hear how people evolve in different ways. I talk about the traditional one, but it just doesn't have to be traditional
No,
if you don't want it
absolutely.
to be.
And actually, there's some guys that a few things going on again down in the southwest that I certainly want to try in the future. I know Rodney down in Cornwall has been he's been testing out some of our lines actually this year for mullet and for bass. And I've done a little bit of the bass thing, but I've never done the mullet. So that's something that I would certainly like to try in the future as well.
Yeah, I can recommend it. Having spent time with Colin and Paul and the guys, and funnily enough, I was hoping to see if there was some on the Tamar tomorrow, but I'm told the river's pretty big there, comparable to my side on the tour. That it's quite a big river, so I was hoping there might be some around and see if I can tempt those. And I've had great fun doing that. Infuriating but wonderful.
Everyone says it drives you crazy. Is that right?
Yeah, it is that. And again, that's what the more stupid, the more ridiculous, the more difficult it is, the more I enjoy it and the more it interests me. So I'm still trying to figure these ones out. They're thin lips, I think. I'm drifting. I've got some of those little ceramic nymphs and I've used those and I've used other stuff, and just dead drifting them in the flow has been great fun. So I wanted to sort of work on that a little bit more, but it looks like I'm scuppered there. So it's probably back to thinking about grayling. But these podcasts are great because, and particularly when I'm talking to people in the industry, because the industry, when we look at it, we don't always know who the end person is. And it's really nice to be able to talk to you and for listeners to get a sense of you as a person as well. So it makes it less of a corporate entity, but it's the person that they're dealing with as well, which to me is really, really important. And I wanted to get a sense of you before we move on as an angler. What sort of an angler? How would you describe yourself as an angler? Are you one of those sort of people who runs to the river, putting on their waders, falling over, stumbling? Do you take it nice and easy?
No, I am one of those people. I am. It's amazing. I think when you get that, when you do get that day and you know you're going, it's you're up at silly o'clock, and loading up the car and getting the flask ready, and getting there and literally, instead of doing what you should do and take your time and get everything prepared. No, I'm definitely in the other camp. I'm a get the waders on as quickly as possible. As if we're gonna miss something, and I'm literally run down that. So that's me. But as far as my kind of ability, I would still put myself very much in the enthusiastic amateur camp.
I'm sure that's not true. I've seen you cast, and I'm sure that's not true. But I think you're being incredibly modest.
Well, I get by, but I'm definitely in no ways an expert when it comes to fishing. But I do enjoy it, and I think because it wasn't perhaps my only or my main hobby growing up. I guess it's kind of something that's always been there in the background, but something that was perhaps never my number one go to when I was growing up, and so later in life, it's just become for me. It is still relaxing. It's never, although I say it's I run down there and I'm in a rush to get there. When I am there, it's still very much a kind of a relaxing thing, and it's just a great way to lose lots of hours.
Yeah, that's a good call. And so are you somebody, because I think, again, with my friend Warren, we're entering some sort of arms race that over the summer, I spoke to him on the phone yesterday, and we're talking about our next trip. And I said, well, do you want me to bring up some burgers? Because he brought a wonderful steak stir fry last time that we sat under an umbrella amazing. In the rain that he cooked. And that's, do you sort of fall into that camp that you like to sit down, have a little bit of lunch and then take stock of things, or do you say, because, and I fully understand if people are listening as well, that if you don't get so many days to fish, you want to pack as much in as possible. So which foot have you got your which camp have you got your foot in?
We definitely have the stop for. Generally, we have. If I'm with friends, we have the stop for lunch for sure. And actually, I've started fishing with my youngest son quite a bit. He's got into it the last few years. The last trip I had was with him at Burrator, and we just had a little stop for lunch and a nice little kind of meze thing going on, a couple of beers, and just had a chat. Because even when you're with someone, you can't really, when you're fishing, you can't really talk to them all the time. So it's nice to have that little break and sit down and have a chat. So actually, another group that I used to go away with, the lunches kind of turned into a little bit too long and a little bit too alcoholic at times. They like to bring a couple of bottles of red, and then the fishing in the afternoon definitely suffered. So they actually decided that they'd put a time limit on lunch after a couple of years, so we didn't get too carried away.
A meze lunch sounds as though you'd slot in perfectly, which I'm thrilled to hear. And I get what you say about the drinking thing as well. And I'm not a particularly big drinker, but there's two things I don't do. One is drink and drive and drink and fish because I'm worried it would get in the way of things. So I've never done it, I don't think, actually thinking about it at lunchtime. But a glass of wine and stuff I know is cool. But yeah, I just don't do it for some reason.
No, and it's probably the best way. I mean, like I say, we now, I literally maybe one beer or a glass of wine. So, and that's not, every time we go, but it's quite nice to have that little social thing going on as well.
Yeah. I know in the last but one trip with Warren, actually, I found this new farm shop on the A303 called Teal's, and I bought a focaccia loaf, and I think we pretty much ate that along with everything else that we bought. It was so good. I'm not getting paid sponsorship for that, but I'm very happy to accept paid sponsorship for that focaccia loaf. It was so good. So that was really, really cool. So it's lovely to get a sense of how you feel about fishing, and that's great. I think that will resonate with many people listening. As I mentioned in the intro, I only wanted to touch on it briefly, but I know in a previous life that you were a golf pro.
Yeah.
And I often think about the similarities between a golf shot and a cast, and I'm thinking about timing, application of power, all those sorts of things. Does that sort of something that registers with you?
Yeah, I think definitely as far as the timing thing goes. I mean, growing up, I played literally every sport you could think of. So I was kind of jack of all trades, I guess, and golf was just one of those. But the timing, as you say, the timing element of golf is similar to fishing, the transition period. So that there's obviously a big transition point in golf from the top of the backswing into the downswing where there's a shift of weight, and that's similar to the rod loading and the transfer into the forward cast. As far as other things that don't work necessarily between the two, and Nick Hart would testify to this because he gave me my first lesson in fly fishing, and one of the things that you do in golf on the backswing is you have a definite hinge of the wrists. And so the first thing I was doing when I was casting a fly rod, as I went back, instead of keeping my thumb nice and high, I would literally let my wrist hinge so the rod would drop way too low on the back cast. And that was the first thing he noticed. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, that's golf. I'm so used to getting that hinge of the wrist." So yeah, although the timing thing definitely works because I get the timing quite nicely with the fly rod. There are things that perhaps don't work as well, and that's also evident in lots of sports. There's some sports that mix with others, and some that don't. So.
Yeah, that sounds a small issue. I know when I used to teach, I think it was squash players, I was thinking I'd immediately, because I'd ask them, and then as somebody giving a lesson, you can sort of make comparisons or get people to think about those things. And often I think squash is very, very wristy. And we had Jethro Binns on actually, and I talked to him about that. I said, because when I would teach people who played squash, it was incredibly difficult to get somebody to not rotate the wrist as far as they were doing it. But tell me something. It's interesting. As somebody who used to watch golf swings, I still, and although I'm not teaching anyone now, that even if I watch another sport, and it might be golf, I've no interest whatsoever in playing golf, but I love watching professional golfers play it because
Yeah.
it's such a phenomenal, um, to me, game to be able to try and master, and your risk reward just doesn't make sense to me as the average punter. Yet when you see somebody hit a golf swing that's nice, or it might be another sport, as somebody who's watched that stroke, as it were, in fly casting, do you ever find yourself looking at other things thinking, yeah, that was really nice? Is that part of you still hardwired in some way that makes you look at those things still?
Yeah, I think definitely, and I taught for 20, best part 20 years, and so you kind of you so used to looking at people, and the only difference is now when I look at someone fly casting, although I can see perhaps whether they've got a good rhythm or good timing, there's certain things that I can't see. So going back to my youngest son, he's got this weird thing that comes in every so often. He gets a tail in loop, and I watch him and I watch him and I can't see the difference between when the line goes out perfectly and when he gets this loop, and I can't for the life of me see it. So he's going to have to go and see somebody, whether it's yourself or Nick or somebody, to get that ironed out. And so yeah, I see the overall, and I can see when people have got good timing, good rhythm. But as far as the intricacies, I wouldn't say that I can pick those up.
Mm. And one of the things we talk about when I talk with guides and instructors on here as well, just almost finally, that did you think about the mental aspect of the game as well, and people's mindsets when they were approaching? You said it was 20 years you did it, and I know that psychology aspect to sport has come in more recently, but was that something you were aware of, mindset and everything else, when you were teaching people?
Yeah, absolutely, and it resonates with me even more because actually I did later in my golfing career. I actually suffered quite badly with the yips, which, if people don't know what that is, it's a sort of involuntary movement that when there's a still so when you're in a sport where there's a still ball or you're instigating a movement. Darts players get it, golfers get it, other sports, and I had it quite badly in golf. And it is a bizarre thing because you can literally be out there playing perfectly normally, and then just suddenly you just can't take the club away, and it's like a mental block. So I think within golf and lots of other sports, the mental side of it is huge. Probably more so in golf because it is a still ball and it's you that actually instigates that movement. You have all the time in the world to think about what you're going to do. Whereas if somebody bowls a cricket ball at you, then you just react to that ball. If someone kicks a football to you, you react to that football. Um, I don't know whether in fly fishing, whether anything like that would ever. I don't know whether anybody's ever suffered with it in fly fishing. I probably would think not, but it's possible because it is a sport where you are instigating that first movement. Um, but the mental side of all sports is become huge. Obviously, there's high profile guys in lots of sports who have you know got help from people like the guy that wrote the chip book. Like, I know Ronnie O'Sullivan, obviously, genius at snooker, but went through all sorts of mental issues and sort of found help. So yeah, it is a big part. Maybe not so much for the average Joe in the street playing golf, but as you take it more seriously, I guess that's a side that you have to work on too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's going to take us on to the next segment. Although it did remind me, and you were saying about the average Joe playing golf, and my late aunt's husband, Gerald, was a photographer in the 60s in swinging London. And he sadly is not as well as he was, but he was a golfer, and he tells a wonderful story. And I'm sure this doesn't happen in fishing, but it may do. And he always told a wonderful story about the golf club where he played, that they saw a guy on the hole in front of them chip his ball into the lake, picked up his trolley, his bag, and everything else, threw it into the lake, and walked off.
Yeah.
He came back 5 minutes later, took his shoes and socks off, rolled up his trousers, got his car keys out the golf bag, threw it back in the lake, and walked off again. Did you ever experience that? Have you seen that?
You know, I have heard that story. And I think it's been probably embellished by people as to where it actually happened. But I'm sure it did happen. That guy that threw his clubs in and then realised his keys were in there, but still put the golf bag back in the lake after he did his keys. Absolutely brilliant. And it is that kind of sport. It is, it can be amazing and it can be infuriating. And anybody that's played golf will know that. Yeah.
And isn't that amazing that brings us back onto mullet as well then, doesn't it? Which are a similar sort of thing. So,
exactly. Yeah. I'm sure I'm in for all of those frustrations when I finally go out and try and catch a mullet on the fly.
Absolutely. So we're going to segue across now to your career in the fishing industry. And like I said, you're International Sales Director of Cortland, but you've been in the industry a long, long time now, and you worked with Turrells, the fly manufacturer, for a number of years. But then you made the move to Cortland. And I just wanted to get a sense of how you're finding it. How did it come about? Was it an easy decision? Because I know, obviously, the setup that you had there. And I've got to say publicly a huge thank you to you. You bailed me out massively once. That I remember phoning you frantically that I'd been fishing, I think, on a Sunday. I was guiding on a Tuesday and my fly box had fallen out. I was due to guide on the Tuesday. I had no flies. I'd lost everything. They'd either fallen out my vest or wherever it was. And you very kindly helped me out and I came up and bought some flies. So I sort of know the setup there. But was that interesting trip or journey for you to take, leaving somewhere where you'd worked for a number of years to take up a new different role?
I mean, I guess the first major change with me was going from golf to Turrell, really, because I was kind of set as a golf pro, and it was actually my first wife's father who owned Turrell at the time, and he was getting to that point of retiring, and I had no real intentions of leaving the golf industry. But we had a walk one Sunday after lunch, and he said to me that he was thinking of retiring, and that, was I set staying at the golf, or did I want to look at the business? And it was an unbelievable opportunity. He'd grown Turrell into a very good company that started, way back in the 70s with just a few girls tying flies in a chicken hut in Devon. And he built it up. And anyway, I got involved in that. Fast forward, kind of, I was with him for roughly 8 to 10 years, working as a sales director. And then we sold the business to part of our production company in Mauritius. So we had tyres in Mauritius. And the company that were running that, the family bought Turrell. And Todd retired, and I stayed on as a sales director with the new owner for about 5-6 years. And so, that's how I got into the industry. And then I was, I think just things had kind of run their course with me at Turrell. It wasn't that I was hating it, but it just felt like the right time. Dylan, I think, the new owner, he wanted to take it on to different stages, and was maybe looking at the business slightly differently to me. We'd actually, in the last 3 years that I was at Turrell, we had become the distributor for Cortland in the UK and Ireland. So, and I had a long established relationship with Cortland going back right to when I first came to Turrell, because Cortland were actually the distributor for Turrell in the States. And then we continued to make flies for Cortland the whole time that I was there. And so I knew Cortland right the way through kind of their transition period to where they are now. And so when I left Turrell, I'd got a really good relationship with John Wilson, who's the president of Cortland now. He'd the guy that was running international sales for them had left a couple of months before. John was kind of overrun trying to cope with that himself and needed somebody to do it. And he kind of said to me, look, I need someone to do international. Would you be interested? And again, it was kind of a no-brainer for me, because it was at a time where Cortland had really kind of turned things around from a quite a turbulent kind of 10 years. And there was some proper product development going on. There were some good guys involved with the business. John was running things the right way. He basically turned the company around from being in quite serious trouble at one point to really starting to build their way back up, and that's continued. Hopefully, I think I've helped them to do that, and the Cortland name is now in a much and the company is in a much better place than it was 10 years ago, and it's exciting to be involved at a time where things are on the up.
That's great to hear. And I think it speaks volumes about you as a person as well, that when the buyout of Turrell came about, that you stayed there for 5 to 6 years. It would be easy to say, well, I'm off now, or it doesn't work. And it also speaks volumes of how they felt about you as well, that, they didn't instigate change or anything else. So kudos for that as well. And I'm interested and intrigued to learn more about what Cortland are up to. But I think it would be wrong for me. I wanted to bring up about, let's talk about the Cortland, the 444 Peach, which I'm sure many listeners know about. But for me, in what seems to be an ever increasingly faster marketplace, they have continued to put that fly line out, which I think speaks volumes for it, and not changing or tweaking a winning formula. Do you think, I guess first off, with your Cortland hat on, you must be extremely pleased that there is a product like that has great history, great heritage, that pretty much sells itself. But do you feel that products sometimes are brought to market even quicker than they used to be? Or is that just me standing on the sidelines looking at it?
Well, no, I think that's true. I think in certain areas of tackle, people tend to bring out products. They almost feel like they've got to bring out something new every year. And to a certain extent, I guess in fly lines, we're always looking at new fly lines and how we can improve, and how we, what tapers or what differences we can make to a certain area of the sport. But the 444, has been just such a successful line over the last sort of 40 years, and it's still a great fishing line. It's the thing is with fly lines, there's only so much you can do to change them and make them better. And sometimes some of the changes that you make in fly lines, they will make one aspect of the fly line better, but they won't necessarily improve it overall. So, for instance, the peach is a very supple fly line. So it's made with a braided core. It's very supple. So it has very, very little memory or no memory in most cases. So you can fish it, at any time of year, whether it's quite warm or whether it's cold. It's a great line for the UK because we never really get it so hot that there would be an issue with the coating, which you could get at very high temperatures because it becomes a little bit tacky. But the peach performs really well for the UK. It's probably why it is so successful. It's certainly everybody's go-to line on small still waters in the winter as well, because you just don't get the memory. So what some of the newer lines, what they've done, and we've done it too in some of our lines. So the trout boss, for instance, that we do now has got a much harder jacket on it. So it's much slicker. It's got some treatments that we do. We do a heat treatment which seals out stops any sort of dirt getting into the line. So there's lots of things that you can do to a fly line that make it nice and slick, and it will make it cast really well, and it will make it cast further. But if you change one aspect of a fly line, then it changes other aspects as well. So when you hear people talking about they get a lot of memory on a fly line, now that fly line will almost certainly be much harder than a peach. It will have a harder jacket, so it would perform probably quite well in normal warm conditions in the summer. But when you get either early season in the spring or you get fishing now, you would find that you would start to get some memory. And it's not that there's anything wrong necessarily with the line. It's just that because of the makeup of that line, it will tend to get that slight memory issue. So that's a kind of a loose description of how you can change fly lines to make them cast better, but they don't necessarily always fish better. So that's one thing there.
Nice. That's a good point as well. And while you were talking, I was thinking that there were only a couple of things. I remember speaking to Jim Barchi at Scott many years back, and the G2 rod was a similar sort of case that, they just kept making it until I think they've only done in their career 3 iterations now of that G series rod in however many years. And it is the classic case of if it ain't broken, don't fix it, and you don't need to.
Yeah.
It brings me on nicely as well, because I was thinking about when they brought a rod called the S4 a little while back, and that was their first stiffer, faster rod. And I went through a lot of lines, and I remember I had a peach sitting there, like many people listening. I had a peach and put it on, and I thought, geez, this really works nicely. And I spoke to people much smarter than me about it and said, look, what do you think? And it was really pleasing to hear that. And I think as anglers as well, the term all-rounder is a good one to have. And I think that ticks the box rather nicely, doesn't it?
It does. Interestingly, the peach actually, although it's actually more popular this side of the pond, as you say, than it is in America. So in the States, they've tended to go more for some of the newer lines, some of the like the Trout Boss, the ultralight that we've got in the range now. And again, perhaps because conditions are a little bit warmer over there generally. So they probably find that those lines fish better throughout the year. But it's interesting you talking about the faster action rods, and it's one area of fly lines that I think people generally need to learn more about to make a better informed decision as to what line they choose to go with whatever rod they may be using. And without delving too much into technicals, but probably most of you know about the AFTMA rating of fly lines, which actually was brought out in the 60s, I think the early 60s. And that was actually Leon Chandler. He was the president of Cortland at the time. He got together with a group of guys, and they brought out the AFTMA rating, which basically meant that you had a 7-weight rod and you put a 7-weight line on it. It was easy. So most of the rods then were all kind of the same action. So it was very easy. If you had a 6-weight rod, you bought a 6-weight line. Now, people will know now that isn't always the best way. So what happened was, as the rods got faster, they a 6-weight line wasn't perhaps loading a 6-weight rod properly. So people would then fish a 7-weight. And that was fine also because, again, it was an informed decision, I guess, and because all the lines were still the same. And then what happened was manufacturers started to bring out lines that were a different weight. So not every 7-weight was the same. And this is what kind of clouded people's judgment, if you like, that it's actually quite difficult to choose the right line for your rod if you don't know exactly what weight that line is. So what I would urge people to do is to at least learn a little bit about the grain weights of fly lines so that you can make a better choice. So for instance, our 7-weight peach, for instance, is 185 grains. Now, as I said before, that there was a time where all 7 weights would have been 185 grains. But now we're in the situation where some companies will go half a line. So our 7-weight is 185, and our 8-weight is 210. Now, what will happen is some manufacturers will put their fly lines a whole line weight heavy. So their 7-weight would perhaps come out 210. Some companies will put it half a line weight heavy, so it might come out 190, 195. What we did to start with, we left everything, and the 444 range, the complete 444 range, is still on true line weights. So they're all the 7 weights of 185, all the 6 weights of 160, etc. We then had the situation where people were coming to us with a rod that they bought, 7-weight rod, they put a 7-weight peach on it, and they said it doesn't cast properly. And that's effectively because the rod wasn't a 7-weight. It wasn't acting like a 7-weight. It was really, it was an 8-weight. So they needed an 8-weight line. So we kind of fell into that period of having to produce lines that, so we know, so like our Trout Boss is a full line weight heavy. So the 6-weight is 185. Now, that's okay if people know that. So, so in other words, if you've got a fairly fast action rod, you would want an 8-weight peach or a 7-weight Trout Boss. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous, but we were almost forced to do that. Now, we've also got the situation now where there are companies out there where they've got a 7-weight in the range, which is 295 grains. Now, for those people that don't know, that's effectively a 10.5 weight line. So people they've got a 7-weight rod, it might be fast action, they think, oh, I'll put this 7-weight line on it. Well, actually, they'd be much better putting a 6-weight on, which sounds ridiculous. So it's making an informed decision. And I think people, if they can just find out how their rod casts, and once they've got a line that they know works with it, then they need to just check the grain weight of that line to make sure that when they're ordering lines in the future, that they're ordering the correct line. The other thing that you can do is obviously you can speak to somebody that has the information and that knows. If anybody ever is unsure as to what line they should be putting with their rod or what weight line, I'd be more than happy for them to contact me and ask me, say, I've got this rod, what line do you think I need for it? So there's nothing worse for somebody than getting, having a rod where the line is underweighted because it, as it just won't cast properly. But also you don't want to go the other way and get it so overweighted that it's overloading the rod, because you get all sorts of issues that way as well. So it's about making a decision based on the right information rather than guessing in some cases.
I think that's brought up so many points and questions for me. The first one, if it's that heavy, it's going to look like a pile of spanners. It's probably going to look like a Skagit line as well, which I'm sure would be detectable very, very quickly if you saw it being cast. There's also the argument there for, if you're able to get along to a tackle shop and try stuff with different lines. That makes life a whole lot easier as well. And I'm also
Absolutely.
thinking about from a rod manufacturer point of view as well. And to me, at least, it feels as though we've gone through that ultra stiff, ultra fast rod action. Now, I don't know what the reason for that is. It may be breakages. It may be whatever it is that people are whacking it, or it's too stiff, or whatever. It may be manufacturer process, resins and everything else. That it may be that people are moving to less aggressive, stiff tapers. So as a result of that, are you detecting that as a company that brings out some rods? But also, is that, as a result of that, do you think that will bring rods back into the correct grain windows?
I think it. I think it could. I think that the only thing that I would like to see, and I know Brooks, who's our fly line guy in the States, I know one of the things that he would love to see. I think it's maybe not up for us to say to a rod manufacturer maybe what they should be making, but what we'd like to see is we would like to see a rating on the rod. So if someone brings out a 7 weight rod, they write 7 weight on it. Well, instead of writing 7 weight on it, maybe put 7 weight, but also put, grain weights 190 to 210 or 190 to 215. At least then someone can look at it and go, well, okay, so I've got a rod here that wants a 210 fly line, so I'll buy a Trout Boss 7 weight, or I'll buy a Peach 8 weight. And then they can make an informed decision. So we would certainly like to see rod manufacturers putting that on their rods.
So do you think that opens the door? Because I was thinking what you said about rods, and I think there are some double handers that had it. I don't know if they still do. But do you think that opens the door then to us forgetting about the rating system in a numerical sense and just purely rating a rod by grain weights and saying this is a grain rate,
Yeah,
this grain weight is great for fishing small still waters or whatever? Do you think that's a direction we need to look at?
I certainly do. Yeah, I think it's, at the end of the day, as I've been explaining, the fact that something has got 7 weight on it now, it actually really doesn't mean anything anymore. And I know Charles Jardine actually wrote an article in Tackle Trade World talking about this and saying, look, come on, as an industry, we need to get better. And I think it would be. I mean, we certainly put the grain weight. If people work in grams, it's quite easy to work out the equivalent gram weight. And I know in Scandinavia, they tend to work on grams rather than grains. But yeah, absolutely. I think if the rod companies had a grain weight on the rod, and we just had a grain weight on the line, people would quickly get used to the fact that that's the information they need, rather than this is a 7 weight, this is a 6 weight.
Yeah, yeah, that would be a fascinating way to go. It would make that process so much easier as well, wouldn't it? And it just takes somebody to do that. And I guess everyone's sort of thinking about these things, and we all know it. And as end users, we do. I think the days of I think about rods and lines that I don't go a line heavier for the fishing that I'm doing. I find a line that's suitable for the fishing I'm doing. It may be towards the upper end of those tolerances, but I'm aware of what they actually are and how they work. But it's those extremes, aren't they, that make it look something that it's possibly not. Whereas it just needs a little pulling in just a little bit to make it easier for people to say, right, okay, well, look, these lines are in this. And all it takes is 2 or 3 manufacturers and to say, right, okay, this is what we're going to do now, boom, 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 boom. And then everything else I would suspect, fall into place quite nicely, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think it would. And it's, like you say, the thing I get frustrated. I see things on some of the Facebook groups and some of the forums where someone will just automatically recommend a line weight heavy for someone. So they'll say, "Oh, do I want to buy?" And quite often, what they're actually doing is they're not recommending a line weight heavy. They may be recommending 2 line weights heavy because the line is already 1 line weight heavy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't know if that person can cast or how they cast, what they do. Do they take 23 false casts to get the line out? Do they shoot? I suspect if you're 2 line weights heavier, it's a point and shoot situation, or it should be with a line that way. But you don't really know, do you? Whereas if there is, this is really, really interesting to me that, if you know that's the grain window, boom. And as a producer of salmon lines as well, that's gone that way relatively easily, and people have picked that up relatively quickly and simply, haven't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've all seen that guy down on the trying to cast a line that is underweight as well, and he's constantly false casting, thinking why isn't this line going out? And it's because it doesn't match the rod. So it's so important, and and the thing is that sometimes the fly lines, they are that they've come on so far, and the technology is there, and everybody should have a line that performs well with the rod they've got, and it would just improve their fishing experience so much if they make sure they get that right.
Yeah, that makes a hell of a lot of sense. Here's a question for you then. What is the most important piece of fishing tackle?
So I'm going to say the fly line now. Yeah,
good,
I am.
Good.
I am actually going to say the fly line. The reason being, when I first started fly fishing, I actually went into Summerland's Tackle in Westwood Ho, which was also run by an ex-golf pro, which is quite weird. But so the first rod I bought, I think, was a Shakespeare. I think the reel, I can't even remember what it was, because he said to me, "Oh, don't worry about spending money on a reel. That just holds the line." That kind of old thing that people said. But he said, what you do need to do is get a decent line. And he actually sold me a Cortland line at the time. It was a 333. So it was a sort of 30 quid price point. Now, bear in mind that was more expensive probably than the reel, and was probably half the price of the rod. But he was absolutely right, because, with fly fishing, the line is the thing that gets the fly out to the fish. So if you can have the most expensive rod, and you can have a lovely reel on the rod, but if you haven't got the right line, and you haven't got a decent fly line, then it does make things difficult. So I think it was good advice that I got back then. And I've certainly tried to say to people, try and buy the best line that you can. It doesn't have to cost you £100. Obviously, the peach, even with the situation with the currency in the UK at the moment, but the peach is still around about £60, so it doesn't have to cost you a fortune. And it's important that you get something that's going to work.
Yeah, that's the perfect answer. That's exactly the one I was hoping for. And yeah, a rod's not going to work if you haven't got anything to work it properly. Everything else, the fly choice, everything else doesn't matter if you can't make the rod and line work together. So perfect answer there. I've been thinking about a conversation we'd had on the phone the other day as well. Let's come on to rods very, very quickly, because I know Cortland do some rods. And before I go on to this point, actually, because I wanted to, it's an interesting choice that you have. And it seems to me as though you have rods that will do Euro-nymphing applications and then rods more for still water applications. Is that fair to say, or is there anything else in the lineup? And can you tell us a little bit about the lineup and what it actually involves, if I've got that wrong?
Yeah, so John Wilson, the president at Cortland, he's got a long history with fly fishing and with rod manufacturers. He used to do some work with Loomis years ago. So he was keen to bring in some rods, and we went for a very kind of niche range, I guess. The nymph rods, we work with a lot of guys that fish that method. A lot of very good anglers, ex-world champions, Valerio in Italy, Devon in the States, and we wanted to bring out a range of rods that were perfect for what they're meant to do. So the Mark II nymph rod has been very successful. It's run now for about 5 years maybe. And again, we didn't want to be in a hurry to kind of add rods every year. It's got a really good following. There will probably be a new nymph rod at this time next year. So it'll be in the catalogue for 2024. And again, hopefully sort of a step up again as far as quality. But we do in the nymph rods, we've done a range. So we do a 10-foot 2-weight, 10.5-foot 3, an 11.2, and an 11.3. So it's a very niche, small range. It's got a really good following. They're excellent rods for anybody that does Euro nymphing. And then we also have a mid price point nymph rod, which is the nymph series rod, which sells at around about £300. Which again we do in just 3 models: a 10.5, 2, 10.5, 3, 10.5, 4. So it's a good way for people who want that sort of entry level rod to come in. The competition nymph rod that we did for the still waters, we did a 10-foot 6, 7, and 8 weight. They had success. I think what we've learned from probably our venture into high end rods is that perhaps that high end, as far as the lake rods, it's a just massive competition in that kind of sector. So the plan is to bring out a range of lake rods and also some river rods next year, sort of regular stuff like 9-foot 5s, 9.4s, but again in that sort of mid price point. So I think our high end rods, I think, will stay just in the Euro nymphing rods. Is where we've kind of found a little niche where because we do the rods, we do the lines, we do the indicator mono, tippet ring. So we do a whole range of nymphing products, and that's been successful in all over the world actually. And has got a good following now. So I think we'll continue on with that. And in the other areas, I think we'll bring in kind of a more mid-price point rod round about the £300 mark.
Nice. Well, I look forward to seeing that. That entry level 10.5 footer sits nicely in the lineup for me as well. So I may be sniffing that out a little bit later. I'd like to move on a little bit. And, we talked about landscapes changing a little bit and how we'd like landscapes to change when it comes to grain windows and everything else. And I look with great interest at the modern world and away from fishing and sometimes into it. I look at our culture and I look at the influencer culture with great interest. And it seems to me that landscape is changing. And companies, and I know we've talked about it on here before, that companies realize that there is no metric to measure the, let's say, influence of an influencer. And I'm not just talking about fishing here. There's no way to measure that metric. And so I'm probably not going to buy a rod if I see a picture of it next to a fish. I'm going to buy a rod if somebody like yourself or Paul Proctor or Charles Jardine, as you mentioned, Pete Cockwell, people like that, Stefan, people like that say, yeah, this is a really good rod, Pete. I'm probably going to buy it. Rather than, and I can understand, and I'm using rods as the example here because I can understand waders, a picture of waders or a jacket or stuff like that. I understand, but I'm never going to buy a rod because somebody's put a picture of it next to a fish or whatever that may be. I'm looking, I want to try it myself. And I looked the other day and I saw I'm going to call him, again in inverted commas, a review, but the person, all they really did was describe what the rod looked like, which for me, I don't care that much about the cork. If I'm spending a lot of money, the cork's got to be good, but I don't look at it under a microscope. All I care about is the blank. What is the resin like? What's the modulus? Everything else that I'm interested in, what can I make that work with from there? And I know when we talked the other day, because it seems to me that companies, I'm more likely to buy something if you put something out saying this is our latest rod, this is and there's video, there's whatever it may be that goes with it, and there's a great way to do that now and reach so many more people in a different way. And I know we were talking the other day, and you said to me that you'd written some stuff for the Cortland website that went out on that website, and as a result, it worked really, really well for you. I know you work with a very small group of seasoned professionals as well, but do you detect that? And I'm asking that question only because that's sort of, it seems to me that's how you're thinking. And I think a company, when they're producing their own media, have got this is only my humble opinion, have got a better way of engaging with their end user rather than via a third party. Is that what you've kind of been thinking?
Yeah, I think so. I think the influencer thing is obviously huge in certain industries, and there are certain industries perhaps where it works better than others. I agree with you. I don't think somebody who just happens to be standing there holding a big fish with say a Cortland cap on is going to make someone go and buy a Cortland Fly Line. So we've tended to try and get much more content based media. So we're working much more on we're doing the blog I wrote was following Valerio while he fished at the Masters in Italy, and it was kind of a day of him fishing and how he goes about it. And yes, he uses Cortland rods, but he uses Cortland rods because he wants to use them, not because we pay him to use them. The guy's a double world champion, so he's not going to go and fish a competition with a rod that he doesn't think is perhaps the best for him on that day. So we tend to do that. We've just actually, and I think podcasts, this podcast I think has been great. I listened to this while I was on holiday. Actually, I listened to quite a lot of your editions while I was sat by the pool. And I think this gets information over to people much better than seeing something on Instagram or Facebook. So Cortland have actually just started their podcast called Hooked. They've recorded a couple of episodes already. They're getting different guests in each week, similar to you, and just talking to them about their fishing adventures and their experiences, and maybe touching on tackle and talking about it, but not just ramming it down people's throat to say, oh, you need to use this. One of the things that, going back to when I was a golf professional, one of the things that you quickly realize when you're in an industry is that ultimately you're there to try and help people to get more enjoyment from their pursuit. So in golf, by teaching them, I was helping them to improve and get better. If they came to me and said, what would you recommend? What shoes would you recommend? What clubs would you recommend? I have to make sure that when I'm selling or recommending those products to that person, that they're going to be right for them. So when they go out, they work and they play better. And I think that's really important in fishing, that people get an informed choice as to what they're going to use or what they should be using, rather than just, shoving something on a camera and saying, oh, you need to use this. Well, why do I need to use that? Why do I need to buy that line? What will that line do that this line won't do? What will that rod do that this rod won't do? So the more content-based promotion, if you like, that we can do, then the better, because it helps us and it helps the end user.
Yeah. And the key thing about that for me is there's no ambiguity either. If it's Cortland putting out content, then you know where you stand with it. You can go down a difficult route with those things. And even when I was guiding, I never sold tackle because I didn't want it to be about that. Now, I could have sold a lot of tackle, but I wanted to. And it's interesting for me because sometimes people think we have no adverts in the magazine because I'm anti-tackle industry. I'm not at all. If anything, I'm more pro than a lot of people out there. And this is a way of supporting it. It was purely that we came late to the market, and I didn't think the model of bringing a magazine on advertising revenue would work. So that's why I didn't do it. And this is a way for me now to support something that I believe strongly in. But having products that you are pushing via your own channels, I think is a whole lot easier. And it's easier for you, like you said in the piece that you wrote, to measure that metric. That has resulted in X sales as a result of that. That has worked. And people know where they are. So you're directly interacting with that end user. And that's really important. And it's really, really easy to do right now, isn't it? With social media the way it is.
Absolutely, it is. And it's what people want to see. People don't, we all get enough adverts and things popping up every time we go on our social media. People have had enough of that. What they want is they want content. They want to learn more about their sport, about what they should be doing, and I think it is changing. I think it's definitely changing. I think hopefully we're helping for it to change. And I've seen lots of things, in the UK, lots of people that are now focusing more on that than just the photos and the hashtags and that kind of thing. Yeah. So I think it's improving, and I hope it continues, because it's certainly the best thing for people. The more information they get, the better.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I hope that the rod rating thing comes to something a little bit more as well. And I'll do my tiny, tiny little way to try and push that, because I think that's a really interesting topic and interesting thought, and one that makes life so much easier for us end users as well. So long may that continue. Can you believe we talked well over an hour now?
No, it is amazing. But no, it's been great, Pete. I really appreciate you having me on. Hopefully, I've helped to make people more aware of their choices as far as fly lines, but also hope that they've enjoyed it. And like I say, if anybody ever wants to get in touch with me and ask me advice on lines or anything else, then hopefully we can put my contact details and they can get in touch.
This has been a great example, actually, of one of the reasons I do this. I love talking about fishing all of the time, but what's really important to me is people get to see the person behind the name, and for Europitch yourself, and get to see they're a human being. They feel exactly like we do about many of the things that we talk about, and they're trying to affect a bit of change as well. So I'm all for that. Simon, where can people get contact details for Cortland? Where can they get contact details for yourself and social media channels? Anything you want to fire out there?
Yeah, so as far as Cortland go, obviously cortlandline.com is the main website. As far as contact details for me, if they send an email, there is a area on cortlandline.com where they can just send a message to Cortland and just mention where you are in the world, and that will get forwarded to me and I will answer.
That's fantastic. Simon, it's been great to catch up with you as always. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Fly Culture podcast today.
Thanks, Pete.
Everyone, this has been another episode of the Fly Culture podcast. As ever, I try and vary and alter the content that we have in these chats that hopefully make them interesting for you, and even 150 so later that you're, or plus, so that you're still enjoying those. This one has been a great chat, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as me. If you could consider perhaps subscribing, and perhaps if you have enjoyed it, leave us a little review as well. We're not looking to make money out of this in the slightest. It's just want to spread the word and give something out to the fishing community. But thank you so much for listening to the Fly Culture podcast.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter.